20 Dark Secrets Behind America's Global Dominance. The truths buried beneath flags, freedom, and firepower. America, the so-called land of the free, has built its empire on a foundation that the world rarely sees. Behind its democratic ideals, its image as a champion of liberty, lies a shadowy history of manipulation, exploitation, and power grabs. These dark secrets, often glossed over in textbooks, reveal the true nature of the American empire. From backroom deals to global interventions, America's rise was anything but peaceful. Let's uncover the darker side of the American dream. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823. When President James Monroe declared in 1823 that Europe should not interfere in the Americas, it sounded like a noble defense of sovereignty, but in reality, was the first step toward American imperialism. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't about protecting Latin American nations from European colonization. It was about giving the United States a free pass to dominate the region. The U.S. used this doctrine to justify dozens of interventions in the Western Hemisphere. From overthrowing governments to backing brutal military regimes, the Monroe Doctrine became a convenient excuse for American expansionism, using so-called protective power to meddle in the internal affairs of sovereign nations. It was the beginning of a long history of U.S. interference in Latin America that continues today. Annexation of Hawaii, 1898. The annexation of Hawaii in 1898 was an act of imperialism masked as progress. In 1893, a group of American businessmen and sugar planters, with the support of U.S. Marines, overthrew Queen Liliuokalani, the rightful monarch of Hawaii. These foreign business interests wanted to ensure a steady flow of sugar and gain control over Hawaii's strategic military position in the Pacific. Despite widespread native opposition, the U.S. government moved to annex the islands. With its annexation, Hawaii's sovereignty was erased, and native Hawaiians were forced into American imperial rule. The annexation wasn't about helping the Hawaiian people. It was about furthering America's military and economic dominance. Panama Canal Deal, 1903. The construction of the Panama Canal is often seen as a triumph of engineering, but its origins tell a much darker story. In 1903, when Colombia rejected the idea of a canal through its territory, the U.S. backed a Panamanian revolution. Within days, Panama declared independence, and the U.S. quickly recognized the new government. In return, Panama allowed the U.S. to build the canal and control the land surrounding it. The canal itself became a symbol of American dominance, but the way it was secured, through manipulation, military force, and disregard for sovereignty, left a bitter legacy. Panama's independence was only granted because it served American interests, and the people of Panama paid the price for U.S. expansion. The Banana Wars, the so-called Banana Wars, were a series of military interventions in Latin American and Caribbean nations, driven by U.S. corporations like the United Fruit Company. These wars weren't about fighting communism or spreading democracy. They were about securing American business interests, particularly the banana trade. U.S. Marines were deployed to protect the economic dominance of fruit companies, while local workers and governments were forced into submission. These interventions were often brutal, destabilizing countries and causing lasting damage. In countries like Nicaragua and Haiti, American soldiers overthrew governments, crushed labor movements, and set up puppet regimes to protect corporate profits. The Banana Wars left a legacy of mistrust and resentment toward the U.S. in the region. Overthrowing Iran's democracy, 1953. In 1953, the CIA orchestrated a coup in Iran to overthrow its democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Why? Because Mossadegh had nationalized Iran's oil industry, removing control from British and American oil companies. In response, the U.S. orchestrated a covert operation, Operation Ajax, that toppled Mossadegh's government and installed the Shah, a brutal dictator who ruled with an iron fist. This coup marked the beginning of decades of instability in the region. The Shah's regime, backed by the U.S., was deeply unpopular, and his violent repression only fueled anti-American sentiment. When the Iranian Revolution of 1979 overthrew the Shah, the U.S. was forced to confront the consequences of its interference. Guatemala coup, 1954. In 1954, the U.S. backed a military coup in Guatemala to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz had begun a series of reforms that threatened American corporate interests, especially in the United Fruit Company. Fearing that his reforms would lead to communism, the U.S. government decided to intervene, using the CIA to orchestrate a violent coup. The consequences for Guatemala were devastating. The coup led to decades of civil war, during which the military regime engaged engaged in widespread human rights abuses, including massacres of indigenous people and political opponents. The U.S. intervention destabilized the country and set the stage for further violence and dictatorship. Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin-Lai, 1964. The Vietnam War was one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century, and the U.S. got involved under false pretenses. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked U.S. ships, became the justification for a full-scale war. However, subsequent investigations revealed that the incident was either exaggerated or fabricated altogether. The war that followed led to the deaths of millions of Vietnamese and over 58,000 Americans. It was a war that many now see as driven by Cold War fears and the desire to assert American dominance in Southeast Asia. Regardless of the human cost, the Gulf of Tonkin-Lai showed just how far the U.S. was willing to go to protect its imperial interests. Operation Condor, 1970s. In the 1970s, the U.S. supported a network of military dictatorships in South America through a covert program known as Operation Condor. This operation coordinated efforts among right-wing military regimes in countries like Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay to eliminate leftist movements, using torture, forced disappearances, and executions as their primary tactics. The U.S. provided training, weapons, and intelligence to these regimes, helping to create a wave of terror across the continent. The U.S. saw the rise of communist movements as a threat, and instead of supporting democratic processes, it backed brutal dictatorships that caused untold suffering. The legacy of Operation Condor still haunts South America today. CIA and the crack epidemic, 1980s. While the U.S. government was funding right-wing rebels in Nicaragua, it was turning a blind eye, or worse, to the drug trade. The CIA facilitated the flow of cocaine from Latin America into American cities, creating a devastating drug epidemic. The crack cocaine crisis that exploded in U.S. cities during the 1980s disproportionately affected African American communities. This covert operation destroyed countless lives, with addicts, families, and entire neighborhoods left in ruin. The BOA government, instead of addressing the systemic issues that caused the epidemic, used the war on drugs as an excuse to crack down on the very communities that were victimized by the CIA's actions. Invasion of Grenada, 1983. Grenada was a small Caribbean island with a new left-wing government. The U.S. government, citing the need to protect American citizens on the island, launched an invasion to overthrow the government. The real reason, however, was more about geopolitics and a desire to prevent the spread of socialism in the region. The invasion was a military success for the U.S., but it was a political disaster. The U.S. ignored international law, and the invasion left a trail of civilian deaths and destruction. The world watched as the U.S. flexed its military muscle, enforcing its vision of global order, IMF and global economic leverage, post-Wubiwai ways. After World War II, the United States established the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, positioning itself at the center of global economic power. While these institutions were presented as tools for global development, in reality, they were used to enforce a neoliberal agenda. Through the IMF, the U.S. pushed countries that needed loans into debt traps. These loans came with strict conditions that required the borrowing countries to cut social services, privatize national resources, and open up their economies to foreign corporations. These policies didn't lead to prosperity. They led to a cycle of poverty and instability. Countries that couldn't repay their debts were left at the mercy of Western interests, while U.S.-owned corporations thrived on their resources and Leipzig. This manipulation of global finance kept poorer nations under the thumb of American economic power, benefiting the few, exploiting the many. NAFTA and the hollowing out of industry, 1994. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was hailed as a triumph of free trade, but in reality, it caused immense harm to American workers and the economy. While it was sold as a way to boost trade, NAFTA essentially hollowed out U.S. industry. Corporations, lured by cheap labor, moved production to Mexico, leaving millions of Americans without jobs. Factories closed, entire communities were left devastated, and wages stagnated. Instead of helping American workers, NAFTA enriched multinational corporations, many of which lobbied heavily to ensure the agreement's passage. Mexico, too, suffered, as small farmers and workers were forced into poverty due to subsidized U.S. agricultural products flooding their markets. NAFTA didn't just fail to deliver on its promises, it actively hurt the very people it was meant to help. Iraq War and the WMD-Lie, 2003. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was justified by the claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. exploitation, WMDs. But as the war raged on and no WMDs were found, it became clear that the justification was a lie. The real reasons for the invasion were more sinister: control over Iraq's vast oil reserves, and to establish a foothold in the Middle East after the 9/11 attacks. The war led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and thousands of U.S. soldiers. It caused untold suffering for the people of Iraq, plunged the region into chaos, and created a power vacuum that gave rise to ISIS. The U.S. turned a country that was once stable under Saddam Hussein into a battleground for global power, with the aftermath still affecting the region to this day. Abu Ghraib, 2004. In 2004, images surfaced of American soldiers torturing prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. These photographs, showing detainees being humiliated, beaten, and tortured, shocked the world and exposed the ugly side of America's war on terror. The U.S. government, in its attempt to fight terrorism, resorted to brutal tactics that were both illegal and immoral. Instead of holding the perpetrators accountable, the government tried to downplay the scandal, shifting the blame to a few bad apples. But Abu Ghraib wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a systemic breakdown in values. The images served as a symbol of the moral collapse of the war effort and the erosion of human rights in the name of security. Drone warfare and signature strikes, 2009 to present. Drones are often portrayed as a precise, efficient tool for warfare, but the reality is far darker. The U.S. has used drone strikes to eliminate suspected terrorists across the globe, from Pakistan to Somalia, often with little regard for civilian lives. The policy of signature strikes, which targets individuals based on behavior rather than identity, has resulted in countless innocent deaths. In many cases, entire families have been wiped out by drone strikes based on the mere suspicion that they might be linked to militants. These operations, conducted without oversight and often without transparency, have turned the skies into a deadly surveillance zone. Drone warfare, once hailed as the future of military operations, has become a tool of terror for countless innocent civilians. Collapse of Libya, 2011. The U.S. and NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011, aimed at overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi, has had catastrophic consequences. Gaddafi was no saint, but the intervention lacked a clear plan for what would happen once he was gone. After his ouster, Libya descended into chaos, with militias fighting for control, human trafficking becoming rampant, and a fragile state collapsing. Into civil war. The power vacuum left behind by Gaddafi's removal unleashed widespread violence and instability. Libya's oil wealth was looted, and the country became a base for various extremist groups, further destabilizing the region. What was framed as a humanitarian intervention became a disaster, one that is still felt today as Libya remains in a state of constant turmoil. Weaponizing Syrian rebels, 2011-2016. As the Syrian civil war unfolded, the U.S. government supported a wide array of rebel groups in their fight against Bashar al-Assad. But among these rebels were extremist factions, some of which later joined ISIS or other terrorist organizations. The U.S., in its zeal to oust Assad, ignored or overlooked the true nature of the groups it was backing. By arming and training these rebels, the U.S. helped fuel a war that spiraled out of control, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Syrians and the displacement of millions. The U.S. intervention in Syria not only destabilized the country, but also contributed to the rise of one of the most brutal terrorist organizations the world has ever seen. AFRICOM and U.S. expansion in Africa. In Africa, the U.S. has quietly expanded its military presence through AFRICOM, U.S. Africa Command. While publicly framed as part of the fight against terrorism, AFRICOM's true purpose is about expanding American influence over Africa's vast natural resources, such as oil, minerals, and rare earth elements. Through AFRICOM, the U.S. has partnered with authoritarian regimes, propping up despotic leaders, and even training brutal militaries that have been accused of human rights abuses. This covert military presence has further destabilized fragile states and made Africa a battleground for global superpowers. Meanwhile, the U.S. claims it is fighting terrorism, but often ends up fueling it. Global surveillance empire revealed, 2013. Edward Snowden's revelations in 2013 exposed the true extent of U.S. surveillance. National Security Agency, NSA, been spying on not only its own citizens, but also foreign governments, including allied countries like Germany and France. This mass surveillance program, which involved intercepting phone calls, emails, and even tracking internet activity, turned the world into an open open book for the U.S. government. Snowden's leaks revealed the U.S. had become the world's biggest spy, using its intelligence agencies to monitor, control, and manipulate the global flow of information. It started as a measure to combat terrorism, quickly morphed into a tool of global dominance. Revelation shattered any illusion of privacy. In the modern world, dollar as a weapon. U.S. dollar isn't just a global currency, it's a weapon. Controlling the international financial system, U.S. can impose sanctions and financial restrictions on any country dares to challenge its interests. The SWIFT network and the dominance of the dollar in global trade, America, strangle a nation's economy without ever firing a shot. This financial dominance has allowed the U.S. to impose its will on countries from Iran, Venezuela, punishing them with economic sanctions, freezing their access to global markets. Dollar has become the ultimate tool for U.S. foreign policy, making the rest of the world's economies dance to America's tune. America's global dominance wasn't built on ideals of liberty and democracy. It was forged through covert operations, economic manipulation, military intervention. Secrets behind its rise to power are buried in the rubble of foreign nations, the blood of innocent civilians, in the wreckage of governments that dared to stand up to the U.S. These dark secrets have shaped the world we live in today. If we want to build a future based on justice, we need to confront them. Understanding the truth, the first step toward real change.